Before this video starts, I'd just like to make an announcement. I have the Liberal Tears mug for $14.99 on my website. It is the first link in the description if you want to go pick one up. Don't worry if it breaks when it comes to your house. I'll send you another one for free out of my pocket. I don't care. I want you to get your Liberal Tear mug. It comes in Liberal Tears white with the face, black with the face, white without the face, and black without the face. So pick whichever one you want, and it'll come to your door in about 3 to 5 days. So that should be epic. First link in the description. Thank you. Let's go on with the video.
So tonight you have presented the Republican Party as advocating on behalf of individual liberties, even if that means deregulation so that there could be a smaller government and essentially people can have more freedoms, personal freedoms. Despite the fact that that might undermine the Clean Water Act and lead companies to pollute the waters with toxic waste with no repercussions. However, my question to you is, how can you explain the deregulation that the Republican Party supports for smaller government and simultaneously the hundreds, if not thousands, of bills passed by Republican officials since 2011 that have policed the woman's body and limited female access to contraceptives and to abortion?
All right. Somewhat like the mosquito in the nudist colony, I'm trying to figure out where to begin. Well, all right. So, I'll say a very quick word about abortion, a very quick word about deregulation. Abortion first. We talk about birth control and abortion. Let's set aside for one moment the debate about whether or not abortion is a constitutional right. I would submit that it is not. You can read the Constitution, squeeze lemon juice on it, hold it upside down, it's just not in there. But let's assume it was. Let's assume it was sort of invisibly there as part of the Bill of Rights. Right up there with free speech and right up there with the right to religion and the right to assembly and so on. Here's my question to you. Why should the abortion right be subsidized when none of our other fundamental rights are? I mean, you have a right to free speech. Does the government give you money to start a newspaper? You have a Second Amendment right to own a gun. Is the government going to buy you a shotgun? You have a right to free assembly. You got to do it on your own time. You have a right to free exercise of religion. The government's not going to pay for your churches. So, since the government pays for none of our other fundamental rights, why does this right get to be in a category of itself? That's my point number one. Pivoting to point number two. No corporation that pollutes the water should be allowed to do that because that is an actual infringement upon the common good. In other words, that is actually doing harm to the public. This is completely different from the real point of deregulation. The real point of deregulation is to create a scope in which individuals can transact freely. Now, let me give you an example of what I mean. We have a right to health care, and presumably we have an equivalent right to food, right? To eat. What could be more basic than the right to food? Now, let's assume that the government establishes not Obamacare, because that's health care, but an Obama right to food. And the basic idea here is that when you go to the grocery store, you can get food, and somebody else will pay. So you walk into the grocery store, you fill up your cart. I would submit, first of all, that you will excessively fill up your cart because you're not paying. And you're going to show up at the counter, at which point the woman behind the counter will notice that not only have you excessively filled up your cart, but since you're not paying, you don't care what the prices are. And so suddenly milk will start costing $45 because some third guy is actually going to be footing the bill. Now, I would submit that this is in a nutshell what's wrong with our healthcare system. That whenever you go to the doctor, the reason that it costs $3,000 when you have a cold is not because it actually costs $3,000. If you were paying, they'd bill you $75. But since you're not paying, and the insurance company is paying, and the government is paying them, the doctor realizes, I'm going to run 45 tests, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, it's all going to be money in my pocket, it's going to be money for the hospital, and this poor dude isn't the worst off. So most of the time when we go to the doctor, we don't even ask what it's going to cost because we don't care because some third guy is paying. So the argument for deregulation is to try to create a healthcare system where people do have healthcare protections, but in which costs are kept down because the guy who's receiving the service is actually paying for it. Let me just throw out a wild idea. If the government were to say to you, everybody in this country has catastrophic health insurance from now on. In other words, if you have a heart attack, you have some catastrophic illness, it's covered. But for routine health care, right, everyone who is under a certain income bracket, we're going to give you a $5,000 check, right? You're free to spend that money on health care, and if you don't use it, you can keep what you don't spend. I assure you that this will send a shockwave through the whole healthcare system. It changes the whole set of incentives because suddenly the money is your money. No third guy is paying. Now remember, you're covered for catastrophic, which is actually quite inexpensive because catastrophic events are rare. What actually drives our healthcare costs up is routine healthcare. And that's why Obamacare is so expensive, is it covers routine healthcare.
Antifa is there making trouble, and it really is disgusting that the administration isn't working with the police to shut down Antifa. I mean, this is a violent group that is obviously violating the rights of people to hear free speech, and that's just you can't have a rioter's veto this way. It's really awful.
You know, one thing I actually found kind of interesting about it is that they're in violation of the Klan Act, which was developed to fight the KKK, and now the anti-fascist racists are the ones violating it. And so what are your thoughts on kind of the transition of now they call themselves anti-fascist, but a lot of us think that they're actually the fascists?
Well, I mean,
so
the bottom line to me is whoever brings the gun to the party is the fascist. And these are the people who are bringing the club or the gun. So, but they have a generalized view of the world, which is that everybody who is conservative is a Nazi, and Nazis ought to be punched. So if you use that two-step logic, then everybody who is right-wing ought to be punched. There are two flaws to that. One, you shouldn't punch Nazis unless Nazis are physically threatening you. And two, not all right-wingers are Nazis, but they don't seem to see the connect.
So there's been obviously an escalation in willingness to do violence by these groups on campus and towards conservatives. How do we fight that escalation?
I mean, unfortunately, what you're seeing is you're starting to see groups that feel the necessity to show up and defend speakers, and I think that that's totally within their purview. I mean, I spoke on my podcast this week with a couple of people who showed up at another one of these free speech events in Berkeley, and one of these fights broke out, and it turned violent. If people aren't willing to stand up and defend their free speech, and the police are just going to stand by and do nothing, I don't see what choice people have other than to defend themselves. And listen, I would love to see a situation where none of this violence breaks out. I didn't used to have to bring bodyguards to my public events. I didn't used to have to bring security when I would speak on college campuses. Now, whenever I speak on a college campus, I have to bring 2 members of security, and we have to coordinate with the police beforehand. This is something that didn't exist 2 years ago, and I fear that it's only getting worse because there's a group of people who cheer this stuff. There's a group of people who feel like they've really done some sort of yeoman's work. Now, the irony of this, of course, is that there are certain people on the right who are provocateurs who are waiting for this, who really want this. Like, I'm happy to go speak to a crowd of people with no violence, just to have the discussion. I mean, I'm perfectly happy destroying people in debate, right? I don't actually have to do it physically. But what you see very often is that there are people on the right who are itching for this. And if the left understood that, they'd be much better off because they're actually feeding into a lot of what is driving the popularity of certain political figures.
Yeah. So where do you see this plateauing at a certain point? Where do you think this is going?
I mean, I do think that there will be a backlash at a certain point. I think that there's going to be liberals as opposed to people on the left, and I always make that distinction, who say enough is enough. I mean, you saw Bernie Sanders, of all people, come out and defend Ann's right to speak in Berkeley. I don't know in what alternative timeline, were for some reason in the alternative timeline where Biff married Marty's mom, and everything is explained by this simple divergence in time, but in the time-space continuum. But yes, I mean, now I'm standing with Bernie Sanders and Bill Maher because I think that this has gone so far that even folks on the left are beginning to look and say, this is a little bit crazy. We have to stop this.
So but you know, it's one thing when these speakers coming up, Milo and Ann, they swoop through Berkeley and they cause these incidents, but then the Berkeley College Republicans and all these conservative groups are kind of left there to go to class the next day and deal with their peers. how do you suggest to them they deal with this on a day-to-day basis?
You know, I'm not sure that on a day-to-day basis they're really dealing with it that much from their peers. I think that I think that they're the brave ones because you're right. I mean, I come, I speak, I leave, and they have to deal with the fallout. But the truth is, most people on college campuses don't care that much about politics. Like, this is the great lie of media coverage of politics on campus. The vast majority of college students are totally apathetic about this stuff. They want to smoke pot and drink and have sex and be left alone for the most part to babble back to their professors whatever they think their professors want to hear, get the grades and leave. I mean, that's what most college students are there to do. So, this idea that it's all, people beating on each other for politics, I think there's a certain subsection of the campus that cares deeply about it, but I think it's a relatively small subsection. Going back to my days at UCLA, I'll say it for the rest of the YAF members, the college Republicans, I enjoyed the fight. I think that most people on the right sort of enjoy this. If you didn't enjoy it, then why do it? But, I think that there are some notes that they should, there's some notes they should take, such as don't mouth off to a professor if it means that you're going to sacrifice your grade. I differ from some other people on the right in saying this. I think that it's very foolish for conservatives to give the baton to people on the left who want to use their power to quash conservatives. Instead, get good grades, make lots of money, give donations to the school, and get the professor fired.
So do you see a long-term solution to almost the culture war that you see at university campuses, where they, now that, people think that they're indoctrinating these youth to be, you talk a lot about, the trans rights, culture that's going on and stuff. Do you see us fighting that? Do you see us winning it? How does that happen?
Well, I mean, that's sort of a different kind of question than sort of the free speech argument to a certain extent, because that's where you see social liberals in conflict with certain basic concepts of free speech. Like my view on transgenderism is that you can call yourself whatever you want, but the minute that you demand that I call you something, now you are imposing something on me, and that's not the way this works. So this is that is a bigger battle, but I do think that there's going to be sort of a libertarian agreement that arrives on campus where people say, listen, we'll all just leave each other alone, and that'll be it, and we can all go about our lives. I think that's going to happen in America more broadly, too, because I don't think this sort of tension can keep up. I think there will be a sort of conservative libertarian merger on the right, where people on the right acknowledge that libertarians are basically right about government. Government sucks at everything, so let the government get out of it. And libertarians sort of acknowledge about conservatives that conservatives are right, that you have to have some sort of social fabric that exists largely because of religious communities and people who are willing to pick each other up, so the government doesn't have to do that. And I think that if you have that, then you have the makings for a broad agreement that it's possible for people to get behind on campus. I think it's sort of similar. I think that the number one argument that seems to work when I speak on campuses to kids is just stop being a jackass. Like, why is it your business what I say? Why is it your business what I do? I'm not in your business. Why are you in mine? And I think that a lot of kids resonate to that because they've always made those arguments to conservatives, right? That's the argument they've made to conservatives about sex and about drugs. And my view is, I don't care what you do sexually. I don't care what you do as far as drugs. I do care if you start trying to tell me I can't say certain things that I am certainly allowed to say and that are well within the mainstream of public opinion, by the way.
So how does this translate into elections? Does this atmosphere that exists now, does this help Republicans? Does it hurt Republicans?
I mean, this helps Republicans. I mean, it's become cliche at this point to point to, Antifa and say, this is why Trump, but this is why Trump. I mean, the fact is that Trump was a reactionary force. A lot of people looked at the left. They said they're awful, they're violent, they're over the top, and we're going to react to that by electing somebody who is not going to tell us that we're the bad guys in this particular scenario. I think that Trump was much more a reaction to the left than he was an embodiment of conservatism. That has its upside. It also has its downside. I think that the upside is that you actually have a reaction to the left. The downside to that is that people mistake anti-left for conservative, and these are not the same thing. Just because you oppose the left, or just because, more importantly, the left opposes you, does not mean that you're actually promulgating conservative ideas. I think that holds true for Trump. I think that holds true for Milo. I think that holds true for a lot of people the right has sort of embraced as reactionary forces to battle the left without examining whether these people are actually promulgating conservative ideas or even have read the Constitution.
So I was reading through you did a Reddit AMA the other day, and I was reading through some of that, and you and I actually have something interesting in common in that in 2011,
Aside from the beard.
Yeah. You and I were both actually fans of Donald Trump in 2011 in a certain way, and in that he was independent and he could run. Go back a year ago, and I actually worked for Kasich, and you were not a Trump fan.
No.
And so now, what do you think of his first 100 days, and how do you reconcile all of this?
So what I keep saying about Trump's first 100 days and about his administration so far is that Trump does not have any thoroughgoing worldview other than himself. He's an egotist. He likes applause. Sometimes that leads him to good things. Sometimes that leads him to bad things. So what I see is a guy who's sort of picking issues off the tree. If he leaves his administrators in charge, Sessions, Pruitt at EPA, if he leaves Mattis to do what Mattis does at Defense, those people tend to do their jobs. When Trump sticks his thumb in the pie, things get all bollocksed up because Trump really does not have any expertise on policy. He doesn't even know what he's talking about. The most powerful person in America, the most powerful Steve in America today is not Steve Bannon. The most powerful Steve in America today is Steve Doocy. Right, because what Trump does, he watches Fox and Friends, and then he reacts to whatever is on Fox and Friends, and that becomes his reaction to the day's news, and that drives the cycle. So that means that sometimes that's good, and sometimes that's bad. And so what I keep saying to folks is it's sort of like viewing a Seurat painting up close. If you're really close to the painting, it just looks like a bunch of dots, and you pull out, and then you see that there's actually a design to this. We're too close right now, so it's hard to tell whether this is a bunch of dots that eventually is going to look like Sunday in the Park with George, or whether we're going to pull out eventually and it's just my baby's vomit. I just don't know. So it's a little bit all over the place. I think that I agree with 70% of what he does. I disagree with probably 70% of what he says. And I think that the first 100 days is a really stupid measurement just generally, but what it does tend to do is give you an indicator of what the vision the president has for the country looks like. So Ronald Reagan spent the first 100 days of his administration pushing tax cuts, pushing for smaller government, and even though he didn't pass any legislation, he set the groundwork, and he spent the first 100 days campaigning along those lines. Bill Clinton actually had a really chaotic first 100 days, but he set the groundwork for the idea that chaos was actually going to lead him to shift to the right, because he wasn't effective, and so he had to move to the right and to the center in order to govern well. Trump, I don't know, he never had a worldview. He doesn't really have a vision for what the country should be. Make America Great Again is a great slogan, but it doesn't really explain what he sees as the future for the country. In fact, I wrote a column, it'll be out in a couple days, talking about, there's this idea that we're now living in Trump's America. I really don't think that's the case. I think that we're living in the reaction to Obama's America still. I think that Obama sort of set the groundwork, and now Trump is still living within that framework. He's just sort of reversed the polarization a little bit. So Obama was very divisive. He had particular groups that he decided he was going to drive to the polls. He wasn't going to care about unifying Americans so much. He came about and said, Americans can be unified by this big government ideology that is embodied in me because I am the great uniter. And then he spent the next 8 years basically dividing people for political gain. And I think that Trump is living in that same framework. He's just reversed it. So I'm going to benefit particular political groups in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and I'm not going to benefit particular groups that Obama wanted to benefit, but I generally agree with Obama's basic concept, which is that a bigger government it's possible for us to unify under the auspices of a bigger government through, for example, a $1 trillion stimulus package. We all like bridges. Bridges are great, right? And I think that doesn't bode particularly well for the future of conservatism in his administration, but it all depends on who has his ear. If he's out there campaigning in Pennsylvania and he's doing more speeches in Pennsylvania, whoever cheers the loudest is the person he will resonate to. If Jared and Ivanka have his ear and they're cheering him really loudly, then he will resonate to them. My basic working theory of Trumpism right now is that Trump has a knee-jerk reaction to something that he sees on the news, and then whoever cheers him the loudest becomes his top advisor for the next foreseeable point in time, and then he sees something else that happens in the news. He has a knee-jerk reaction to that. Whoever cheers him the loudest becomes his next political advisor. This explains Bannon. This explains Jared and Ivanka, and we'll see how it plays out as time goes on. This is the problem with having a guy who does not have any real philosophy of government.
So I'm going to take advantage of having this opportunity to ask you questions and get some free business advice out of you. So I primarily run campaigns here in the Bay Area. In the Bay Area, there are 28 elected legislators on the state and federal level. Of the 28, one is Republican. Catherine Baker. So how do we win elections 10 miles outside of San Francisco as Republicans?
Again, I think that libertarianism is probably the best way to campaign in California. I think it is generally, but I think that's the best way to campaign. I also have to say, I said this to Neil Kashkari when he was running for governor over and over and over and over. Why aren't you running on crime? Right? You see that Trump ran on crime and it really helped him. You see, the only time Republicans win in blue areas is when they win on law and order, safety issues, Rudy Giuliani wins in New York because of safety issues. Richard Riordan wins in Los Angeles because of safety issues. California has a spiking crime rate because Jerry Brown has decided to redefine crime down and release a bunch of prisoners into the general population and not fund any of the prison system. And quality of life is declining. It's declining in every major city. It's declining in LA. It's declining in San Francisco. You're seeing an uptick of people on the streets because there's been a decline in funding for mental health services in the state of California. He's run this state as a disaster, and I don't think that it's out of bounds to say if you want a cleaner city, if you want a safer city, then you ought to elect people like Republicans, because what you're doing clearly is not working so far. I think law and order, here's the bottom line. What the statistics tend to show is that overall in the United States, men tend to vote Republican, women tend to vote Democrat. That shifts when you talk about safety issues. This is why in 2004, security moms won George Bush the presidency for his second term. And the same thing is true in major cities. People resonate to the safety issue. And it's something like every time a Republican says, I'm going to run as the education candidate, it's like, what are you, stupid? You know, it's so stupid because it makes for an easy Democratic pitch. Okay, you want to spend X amount of dollars? I want to spend X plus 10 amount of dollars on education. But you actually have the benefit of that same logic with regard to public safety, because whatever Democrat says they want to spend on the police, you say, I want to spend X plus 100 on the police, and you can actually win that particular debate.
You know, it's actually interesting you bring that up. So I was reading headlines today. Are you familiar with the BART system out here? Mm-hmm. And there was a mob of I don't know what you want to call them, but a mob of kids or teenagers boarded a BART train and actually robbed the BART train. And this was really reminiscent of me like the Wow Wow, as you see, people ride up.
Yeah, taking Pelham 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, I mean, so, how do you take that and turn it into a campaign, and how do you turn votes? I mean, so you want to run for a BART director in Oakland as a Republican with things like that going on? That's what I'm saying. How do you get granular and really get votes on the local level?
Well, again, I think that one of the things that Republicans have to assume is that it's going to be a long-term uphill battle. This is not something where you shift it overnight. This is going to be you speaking the truth over and over and over and over without fear or favor. And I think that the idea that Republicans have, which is that they're going to go soft pedal this to particular audiences, that you have to soft pedal to the black community, law enforcement, I think it's insulting to the black community. I think that if you go in there and you say to black folks, well, the reality is that the cops are out to get you, and like Rand Paul has done in certain contexts, and we really have to come up with a better way of doing things. Here is the reality of the situation. Every single community in the United States with a high crime rate has had problems with the police. Right now, the black community in the United States has a disproportionately high crime rate. That means that the police are going to have more problems in those areas. And that is not due necessarily to racism. It is due to the fact that when you bring the crime rate down, there's less areas of conflict. There are just less reasons for friction. And so what you need actually to protect innocent people is you need more law enforcement in these areas. You don't need less law enforcement in these areas. This is why I think the Black Lives Matter movement has done such a tremendous disservice to people who are living in inner cities. When you say take the cops out of the inner cities, the people who suffer are not the
Hello, everyone. Hey, I'm just stopping by to remind you that liberals are insane. Social justice warriors are becoming more violent and triggered than ever before. Anyways, be sure to subscribe to KGP TV on YouTube and have a blessed day. Yeah, man.
Part of the Bill of Rights. Right up there with free speech, and right up there with the right to religion and the right to assembly and so on. Here's my question to you. Why should the abortion right be subsidized when none of our other fundamental rights are? I mean, you have a right to free speech. Does the government give you money to start a newspaper? You have a Second Amendment right to own a gun. Is the government going to buy you a shotgun? You have a right to free assembly. You got to do it on your own time. You have a right to free exercise of religion. The government's not going to pay for you. All right. So I'll say a very quick word about abortion, a very quick word about deregulation. Abortion first. We talk about birth control and abortion. Let's set aside for one moment the debate about whether or not abortion is a constitutional right. I would submit that it is not. You can read the Constitution, squeeze lemon juice on it, hold it upside down, it's just not in there. But let's assume it was. Let's assume it was sort of invisibly there as part.
So tonight you have presented the Republican Party as advocating on behalf of individual liberties, even if that means deregulation so that there could be a smaller government and essentially people can have more freedoms, personal freedoms. Despite the fact that that might undermine the Clean Water Act and lead companies to pollute the waters with toxic waste with no repercussions. However, my question to you is, how can you explain the deregulation that the Republican Party supports for smaller government and simultaneously the hundreds, if not thousands, of bills passed by Republican officials since 2011 that have policed the woman's body and limited female access to contraceptives and to abortion?
All right. Somewhat like the mosquito in the nudist colony, I'm trying to figure out where to begin. Well,
Before this video starts, I'd just like to make an announcement. I have the Liberal Tears mug for $14.99 on my website. It is the first link in the description if you want to go pick one up. Don't worry if it breaks when it comes to your house. I'll send you another one for free out of my pocket. I don't care. I want you to get your Liberal Tear mug. It comes in Liberal Tears white with the face, black with the face, white without the face, and black without the face. So pick whichever one you want, and it'll come to your door in about 3 to 5 days. So that should be epic. First link in the description. Thank you. Let's go on with the video.